Good evening and welcome to this episode of Biz1st in Focus here on TV1. I'm your host this evening, Shaheen Jurampati. Well, today's topic is something which has happened in the country for the past couple of weeks. The country has been plagued by incessant rains, claiming over 2,000 lives in Sri Lanka, affecting over 170,000 people and leaving over 50,000 people displaced. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves in all of Sri Lanka is the country better prepared this time around? And will Sri Lanka be better prepared the next time a disaster is expected in the country? And to ask these questions, we are joined by the Country Director of the Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management, the Country Director, Firzan Hashim. Mr. Hashim, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for the invite.
Mr. Hashim, like I said before, is Sri Lanka better prepared, and will Sri Lanka be better prepared? Now, this has been an occurrence over the past couple of years. Sri Lanka has been quite prone to floods with the slightest rainfall and tends to experience more landslides. So how would you suggest the impact has been with the rains this time around?
This has become actually, Shaheen, the new norm. And we have seen the rains causing havoc, going back to floods and then the landslide as well. If you see the 2016 year and the 2017 years, I personally feel that we are much better prepared than we were in the last 2 years. A couple of reasons. One could be the people who were affected itself, the trauma that they have gone through, and the repetitive trauma, as well as the losses that they have gone through, whether it is their loved ones or the damage to property and so on. Second is the government as well as the private sector and the others around who have seen that this is becoming the new norm, and how can we mitigate these disasters. So I think in one way we would see that we are better prepared now, but there is a long way to go. And if you ask me the question of whether we could be better prepared in the coming years, there's a lot more to do.
Off air we were talking, and you said there's a huge difference between the word hazard and a disaster. Could you speak about the difference, please?
Yeah, certainly. This is with regards to the word hazard, natural hazard and the natural disaster. Actually, there is nothing called natural disaster. It's only about natural hazards. So if you look at natural hazards, it's nature induced. For example, it can be the earthquake, it could be the volcano, it could be the tsunami, which has a potential actually to create harm. But if we humans stand in the way of that harm, then it becomes a disaster. So that's the difference between hazard and disaster. So it is natural hazards which we need to ensure that we take care of, and we don't stand in the hazards way, so that we don't create a disaster.
Mr. Hashim, you said this is now the fact that we're facing floods year and year again is becoming more of a norm. So what do you suggest is the reason for this pattern for Sri Lankans to go through this trauma year and year again, to leave their homes, to gain shelter, at different camps, at different temples, schools, so on and so forth? What could be the reason behind this pattern, so to speak?
Could be climate change. And if you also look at the rain, the intensity of the rain that we are getting in comparison to the few years ahead is much more. Last year we had rains within a couple of days which reached up to over 600 millimeters. This year we had 300 millimeters. So that amount of rain in a very short time, we cannot absorb that amount of rain in those areas. The other is about, the land use itself, then urbanization, and how we are growing, and the use of land, the use of wetland, and where we are placed. And the other issue would also be the drought, which comes in parallel with the incessant rain that we have. So in fact, what I would like to say is moving from the natural hazards to a disaster, it will be repetitive if we don't have a better plan and better governance.
Mr. Hashim, always in Sri Lanka, it more or less seems to be an extreme of one another. If there are no rains, it leads up to a drought. If there is rain, it leads up to landslides and floods. So then again, I suppose it comes to the whole point of climate change once again. Then again, at this point, I ask you, how can Sri Lanka be better prepared for both of these extremes?
This is where mitigation comes in, which is very important. We need the rain in Sri Lanka because there is a drought, as you said. So this is where we need to look at where we are going wrong. So much of rain comes in, 70% of the flow of rain goes into the sea, goes into the rivers. How can we make use of that rain? The other issue that we would also have is on the drought scenario, what are the catchment areas that are available? What are the lakes which are available? What are the ponds? How can we ensure that the water which comes in abundance so much, how can that be secured? How can we use that, reuse it? But to be on the, for the benefit of the government too, if you look at sustainable development, the last budget actually allocated on the mitigation side of it, on the sustainable development, it allocated around 5 billion, I presume, for a reservoir to be built upstream so that this amount of water could be retained upstream so that it doesn't come down over here.
Do you think Sri Lanka is doing enough to tackle and fight climate change which leads up to this extent?
Not enough. To be very frank about it, I think it is not only the government's job, it is not only the private sector's job. I think everybody must get involved with it. So if we are working in isolation and we do not respect each other and we don't work in partnership, I think this will be a continuous disaster that we got to face right throughout.
Mr. Hashim, again, off here we were talking about the trauma people go through year in and year out. It's not easy to, like say in 2016, the weather impacted really bad in Sri Lanka. Yes, more lives were lost in the floods that time around and compared to this year, but we should always remember that every life is important as the other. So it should not be undermined or downplay the fact that just over a dozen lives are lost this time around. But we have to take into account the trauma people go through year in, year out just for the slightest rain.
Yes, I think that is something that everybody should feel guilty about, because no sooner it rains, whether it is in May or whether it is in November, the trauma does come into these families who have lost their loved ones. And also the people who have lost so much of their property. The moment they start up, again the rain comes in. So this is an area that needs to be looked at, and it has to be looked at a holistic way, where the government gets involved and the partnership of the other sectors also come into play.
Well, I'm in discussion with Mr. Firzan Hashim, the Country Director of the Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management. You're watching Biz1st in Focus. We'll go for a short commercial break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Biz1st in Focus here on TV1 with me, Shahil Rampati. Today we are talking to Mr. Firzan Hashim, the Country Director of the Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management, on the incessant rain Sri Lanka experiences and how we can be proactive rather than being reactive. Mr. Hashim, now it is a known fact that Sri Lanka experiences the southwest monsoonal season towards the end of May and all the way up to September. But then again, this begs the question among the general public of Sri Lanka, hang on, should we be ready for floods every time May comes about in a year?
I think as of now, that's the norm, where it rains and then it follows up with floods. Not only floods, actually it's also landslide, which is actually which would take where we lose more lives in landslides. It's also important to understand the change in the intermonsoonal periods and what are the precautions that we need to take. If you are looking at businesses, if you are looking at homes, you have to ensure that since we have this experience for the last 3 years, we have to look at how we can mitigate our losses. How can we at our homes and our businesses be better prepared? If there are issues related to stocks, move the stocks out of vulnerable areas, even if it is vehicles, or you can also look at stocks not to be stocked in a particular place during that period. So reduce those vulnerabilities. So we have to expect the floods until there is sustainable development.
Now, in 2016, when the floods hit really hard to Sri Lanka, a decision was taken by the government to remove all illegal constructions in wetlands and marshlands and so on and so forth, which could indicate that this was the cause for the unusual floods. So how do you think that this is one of the main reasons as well for the floods to occur over and over again?
Yes, the amount of water which can be retained is actually the question that we should ask. What happened to the wetlands? So much of rain comes in, but why does it create a flood? Why does not it absorb into the earth? If not, why does not it be secured in areas that it need to be secured? The other issue that we would also have is, what about the river banks? Why does the river banks, the rivers flow above its norm during rains? So it's that cascading effect that you have from the upstream. So how can you hold the water upstream rather than sending it down, especially if you look at Gampaha, the Colombo districts, where it gets affected by the Kalaniganga itself. So we need to look at how you can retain the water rather than allowing the water to flow out. So that is the area that we need to look at.
Let's talk about parts of Sri Lanka which are constantly prone to floods. For example, like you said, Gampaha, then you have Kalutara, Ratnapura, Matara, Gaul. These particular districts are most often not the worst affected. So could there be a system that could be developed to address certain districts in isolation so that it won't have a ripple effect on other districts as well?
Right. So the districts that you mentioned actually are fast urbanizing. So, and also it's also becoming industrial zones. If you look at Gampaha, Colombo, and then the adjoining districts as well. Habitations gets more. People construct more. If you look at locations, the homes that we had earlier would have a huge garden. But now all those gardens are gone and it becomes a concrete jungle. Then what you would see is the amount of water which collects on the roof and which comes down the gutter moves into the drains and it flows onto the road. And how much of water retains in the earth is the issue. So in that case, what I would say is that we would have this problem because of urbanization. And in addition to that, you would have this urbanized area too, which is beyond the urbanized areas where, as you said, there would be slums. There would be others who would feel that in the urban areas it's very expensive to live in. They would like to live a little bit away, but then it becomes more congested. So all this leads back to sustainable development. The development has to be perfect. The development also has to address these issues with regards to disaster risk reduction. How can you institutionalize disaster risk reduction into development? So that is key.
Mr. Hashim, that's a perfect example of what you just said there. It should be noted that infrastructure for Sri Lanka is absolutely important. Sri Lanka does need highways, it does need industrial zones, because these infrastructure development certainly creates more employment for the country. But like I said, how can Sri Lanka look at a bigger picture and ensure that the risks of not affecting the scope of Mother Nature can still be preserved?
This is where I think we need to look at what are the models which are available in country and outside the country. What are the partnerships that we can make with the other governments, with the other networks, with the global networks that we are working with. So it's very important to understand how development can, if we are having a fast-paced development, how we can ensure that there is no disasters that could occur and we can reduce the risks. So if you look at a few things that we can see is the disaster impact assessment. All these development programs could look at a DIA and see whether that is feasible to be carried out. And that has to be implemented. It's not to be just on paper, but to ensure that it is implemented. Development has to happen. There's no two words about it, but then disaster risk reduction comes first.
Mr. Hashim, how would you suggest that such recurrent disaster situations, floods, landslides, so on and so forth, when it affects the country, how do you think it impacts the economy of the country?
It affects a lot. This is where, even if you look at the central bank annual report, it refers to how the GDP gets affected and the poverty gets affected with regards to both, not only floods and landslide, but even the drought. So we have a huge impact. And even if you look at the expenditure, the recurrent expenditure which some ministries are taking care of to respond to emergencies, it's actually becoming much more than the capital expenditure. So we need to look at the balance. How much of recurrent expenditure are we spending, and how much we can allocate for capital expenditure, which could be more disaster resilient. So I think that's the issue that we would have to look at. Development sensitive, to be extremely development sensitive, and also to be very resilient in what we do.
Well, Mr. Hashim, we're going for another short commercial break. You're watching Biz1st in Focus, and we are in discussion with the Country Director of the Asia-Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management, Mr. Firzan Hashim. This is Biz1st in Focus. Stay with us. Welcome back to Biz1st in Focus here on TV1 with me, Shahin Jirampati. We are talking to Mr. Firzan Hashim, the Country Director of the Asia-Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management, known commonly as APAD. We were talking about disaster preparedness, being proactive or reactive. Mr. Hashim, talking about, now like I said, we've been talking about being proactive rather than reactive, so on and so forth. So over the past couple of years, since Sri Lanka started facing these disaster situations in an unusual way than other times, has the government, has an estimate been made on the losses that have been incurred over the past couple of years, and what is the recovery cost for the casualties that have been caused?
Yes, actually, following the 2016 disaster, there was this PDNA, which is called the Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, and put together the following year, also 2017, another PDNA, Post-Disaster Needs Assessment, that of course concentrated on 5 districts. Then the government with the other stakeholders came up with another document, the recovery plan, which estimates 247 billion rupees, Sri Lankan rupees.
247 billion
as recovery costs. So I'm sure with this, what happened right now, that figure would increase. So where does that go to? Whether it goes into the development activities or whether it goes into the budget, I'm not sure how it has been categorized.
So this 247 billion, so to speak, this is used to pay as compensation for the lives lost and for those houses have been affected?
No, this is in fact the development process of it, to build back better and also to have disaster risk reduction component in the infrastructure as well. So this goes across whether it is social services, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is supporting human settlement, and also whether it is relocating. If you look at NBRO, the National Building Research Organization, they have zoned these areas, certain areas, as areas which are where people cannot live, and they have estimated, I think, about 15,000 houses needs, 15,000 families needs to be relocated. So all that costs a lot, and it is already happening. Then the issue with regards to land, if you are to relocate, where do you relocate? What is the cost for the infrastructure, and who will bear that cost? But somehow we need to ensure that we do that if we are to reduce risks.
Mr. Hashim, now compared to the past couple of years in terms of the disaster situations we've faced, what are the lessons that have been learned this time around? Because we spoke and compared to the last 2 years, casualties have been minimalistic compared to a couple of years. Just over 2,000 deaths and 174,000 somewhat people have been affected. But then what are the lessons we have learned to ensure that there can be zero casualties in terms of human lives?
Yeah. Following the last 2 years, a directive or a mission that we undertook was to ensure this year that we reduce the loss of lives. It is important that during a disaster, first you have to secure your lives, and then the property, and thereafter with regards to their livelihoods and so on. But in this case, we brought this concept to ensure getting partners to ensure that we take preparedness to the ground. And this is where we partnered with Sirasa Gammadda, where they had the base to the grassroots. But all these years we are doing programs, resilient programs, whether it is preparedness, but has it created an impact? Have we ensured that the lives lost have minimized? Have we minimized the loss to property? But this is where we wanted to ensure that it goes national and everybody gets involved. And I think it first started off with a discussion with Sirasa, followed up with a few stakeholders, the humanitarian sector and the government itself. And there was this Face the Nation discussion where they invited the key speakers from key departments. And actually, to be frank, that put pressure on these departments and the individuals to ensure that we go towards zero deaths. Even if a disaster does occur, how can we reduce it? So they went back, they spoke about during that process, went back and did quite a lot. And if you look at the preparedness state, they carried out a lot of programs. They carried out, in fact, they went down to grassroots. But I think the game changer that we saw here was the Gammadda itself. When you do programs on ground to a 50, 100 or 700 or so on, that remains with those people. But then when you show it on television and when you speak about it, and a person who is seated in their living room and watching this, the message goes in. And this is where we encourage partnership between the government, between the media, which is key, and we saw that result right now. One of the many feedbacks that we get back after the Gammadda program itself is the divisional secretaries and the police officers on ground. They used to call us and say, thank you for the program, because now at least the people are listening to us. If we tell them to evacuate, they evacuate rather than rebelling and saying we cannot go out. So there has been a lot of positives, and preparedness is key.
So this is more or less an initiative to get the people more involved rather than the authorities working among themselves and then keeping the factor of the general public at the last. But what you're suggesting is that it is key that the general public are involved first, and then creating awareness among themselves that this is what they're supposed to do in terms of preparing for a disaster, and this is what they're supposed to do responding after disaster.
Certainly. Exactly, that is what is required. See, the government or the authorities, they have the information with them. They have the mechanism. They need to ensure that those mechanisms are very effective. Those mechanisms are there to reach out to the people. If it is a message with regards to evacuation, that has to be timely. It cannot come after the weekend. It cannot come the next day. It has to come immediately. So who is in the front line? It is the people. How do you reach out to these people? So this is where we need to look at who has the networks to these people, and you can't immediately get to the people overnight. So the best way to get to the people is use the networks which are available. See, a few things that we also did was with the corporates. We worked with corporates. We sent out these warnings. We sent out guidelines. Through the Gammadda also, we sent out so many guidelines to the people. So that went to the people. If you take a corporate, if you have about 30,000 or 40,000 employees, and you give the message to them, that goes to 30,000 families on ground, and then it goes to so many villages. So this is where you need to reach out to these people. The facilitation has to be done by the government.
Mr. Hashim, just before we wrap up, quite quickly, now while we're talking about the general public being prepared ahead of a natural disaster, now, like you said earlier on in the interview, we have to accept it amongst us, admit the fact that the month of May could most likely be floods. So, and across the world, there is a topic of climate change. So, just as Sirasa Gamada along with APAD is going to the disaster-stricken areas and the prone areas to create awareness among the people what should be done before and after a flood or landslide, do you think it is absolutely important that in the same platform we go among these people and create awareness among them that climate change is happening and this is what you need to know as well?
Certainly. It is important that the people be made aware of what happens in Paris, whether it is COP21 or whether in Geneva, and which comes over here to the ministries and to our air-conditioned rooms. It needs to go down to the people. And I think we have been extremely bad in conveying that message to these people. It has to be incorporated into the curriculum of the students, in the school curriculum. And the people, and the mothers and the fathers, they need to ensure that they are always worried about their children, whether they'll be safe, whether they'll come back after school during the month of May, whether they will get caught to flash floods or so on. So there is quite a lot of areas that all of us can get together and work in partnership. See, if you look at the networks, now for example, if you look at Asia Pacific Alliance itself, it works in 6 other countries in the Asia Pacific region. And we also have created the Asia Pacific Parliamentarian Forum for Disaster Management, where we brought in the 6 ministers of those 6 countries in the Korean parliament as well as in the Japanese parliament. So make use of those contacts. Then you have what is called the CBI, Connecting Business Initiatives. There is networks in 13 countries. So APAD leads that network in Sri Lanka, and Capital Maharaja has been a pioneering member of CBI in Sri Lanka. So make use of those networks. There is a lot of people who would want to support us, but that support needs to be accepted. So government or the ministries or the departments need to ensure that they acquire and also they harness these resources and then send it out to the people. So the people is key, like exactly what Gammadde is doing. It is for the people. You need to ensure that the people are made aware because they need to take care of themselves, and we need to provide that assistance.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Firzan Hashim, for joining us on Biz1st in Focus this evening. Well, there you have it, Mr. Firzan Hashim, the Country Director of the Asia Pacific Alliance for Disaster Management. And some of the key points he addressed was the fact that the people of a nation, of the world, are key. Climate change is happening. Yes, the authorities and the governments are responsible for the implementation of these programs. But at the end of the day, it's the people who should participate in these events and ensure that their lives are protected. This has been Biz1st in Focus. I'm Shahin Jurampati. Good night.